Last time, we saw the Japanese extend themselves throughout the Pacific, decisively defeating the Allied armies from Singapore to Java, and devastatingly beating the Allied navies from the Indian Ocean to the South Pacific. Or at least that was the last time that we saw the China-Burma-India Theatre, CBI as it's most well known. Now, the Japanese expansion has been checked at Guadalcanal and the Kokoda Track. The IJN has been badly mauled in a war of attrition that costed them their hard-earned superiority at sea, and the IJA has finally lost its invincibility at the hands of the brave and tenacious Australian and American soldiers fighting in the South Pacific. The situation has also changed on the Burma-India front, as the British prepare to launch their first counterattack against the forces of General Iida. So join us as we cover the First Arakan Campaign. Hey history fans, quick channel update before we jump to the video. As we've said previously, most of the money earned by this channel is being reinvested into more better researched and better made videos, as well as our Wizards and Warriors and Cold War channels. We prefer to rely on our kind patrons and YouTube members, and not sponsors. No one likes excessive sponsorships. However, right now having sponsors is a necessity. Still, we vow that as soon as we get to 10,000 patrons and YouTube members, we'll stop adding sponsorships to our videos. We have a great team and we want to be able to continue paying them living or competitive wages and not cut back on production. So until the algorithm is more favorable and we can release more than 3 videos per week, extra videos that our team has created will be posted as YouTube member and Patreon exclusives. 1 or 2 videos per week will be exclusively available for our YouTube members and patrons, whose ranks you can join by pressing the button below the video or becoming a patron via the link in the description. Don't worry though, these videos will not be from one of the ongoing series and will be either standalone episodes or belong to a new series. For just $5 you can support our work, watch exclusive videos, there are 10 now and more are added every week, get early access to free videos, learn our schedule, get access to our private Discord, watch our behind the scenes videos, and much more. Thank you for watching and for your kind support. We wouldn't be able to do what we love without you. In our last episode covering Burma, we left General Stilwell as he continued to plan his desired Burma offensive in October. After negotiations with the Chinese successfully concluded, Stilwell's Pacific Front offensive was approved, on the basis that the Allies were to provide at least 3 battleships and 6 aircraft carriers, obtain control of the air, and dominate the China and Java seas and recapture the Andaman Islands to cover an amphibious landing on Rangoon. Yet upon meeting with General Wavell, the British informed him that there wasn't sufficient infrastructure in the Assam border to support such an offensive yet, and that he was working on a more modest operation against northern Arakan, the Chin Hills, and the Upper Chindwin. Pressured by Washington, however, Wavell had to give his general agreement with it as a basis for planning, as his limited operations could be a stepping stone for Stilwell's general offensive. After this, Stilwell would finally present to Chiang Kai-shek a description of Wavell's plans and the preparations the Chinese would have to make if their share in the Burma campaign was to be a success. The Generalissimo agreed with the plan, but stressed his desire to see Allied naval and air control of the Bay of Bengal, something that Stilwell promised would happen, he himself believing it possible. Thus, Stilwell's Pacific Front offensive officially became known as Operation Anakim, while Wavell's amphibious attack towards Ekyab became Operation Cannibal, and his advance towards the Chindwin River became Operation Ravenous. Since the fall of Burma, however, we must say we've been mainly covering how new developments unfolded for General Stilwell and the Sino-American cooperation, but it's also important to see what the British were doing at the same time. When General Slim arrived with his Burma Corps back in India, he was appallingly met with harsh and barbed criticism about the retreat from Burma, specifically from Lieutenant Colonel Noel Irwin of the 4th Corps. The Burma veterans were also awfully received by Irwin's command, who told them to bivouac in the open mud without supplies or treatment to their tropical diseases for 3 days, until they finally reached Ranchi. It didn't help that India itself was in a complete crisis, and that Japanese bombing raids reached as far as Imphal. On May 20th, Burma Corps was finally disbanded, and Slim took over command of the newly formed 15th Corps in defense of the Bay of Bengal region. At the same time, the command structure of the Indian Army had been reorganized into 3 new armies, with Irwin assuming command of the Eastern Army in July. At this point, India was also amidst a period of serious rioting by nationalists who wanted their independence from British rule, led by the notorious Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru. There could be no thought of offensive action in Burma with such a grave situation in the home base, thus forcing General Wavell to deploy no fewer than 57 infantry battalions in the worst hotspots. It is estimated that the entire war against Japan in Southeast Asia was put back a good 2 months by the Troubles. But there was also another large group of Indian nationalists aiding more directly the Japanese Empire. With the fall of Singapore, tens of thousands of Indian troops had been captured by the Japanese, with many nationalists among them. Major Fujiwara Iwaichi, an intelligence officer, took advantage of this and helped individuals like Captain Mohan Singh and Rashberry Bose create the anti-British Indian National Army out of these discontented prisoners. The first INA would then go on to operate espionage in India and to encourage the defection of many Indian soldiers, while around 40,000 men were trained to fight at the Burma front by Colonel Irakuro Hideo. In the end, however, tensions between the Indian and Japanese commands would see the invaders crack down on the INA leadership, such as the arrest of Mohan Singh, so many Indian soldiers would choose to revert to their prisoner of war status. Between December 1942 and February 1943, Rash Behari Bose would finally fail to keep the first INA united, and it would cease to exist for now. Looking back at India, the civil unrest that it was experiencing had seriously affected the troops' morale and esprit de corps, with a particular unwillingness on the soldiers' part to go on parade. Furthermore, Wavell knew that the Indian Army had been trained to fight in the open country of Iraq and the Western Desert, and had performed miserably in both the jungles of Malaya and Burma. Thus, he considered that the Indians were only partly trained. It's worth mentioning that the infantry soldiers were usually demoralized by the fact that the Japanese ruled the skies, something that actually shows a lack of proper training. As he believed that Japanese soldiers were superior to the British and Indian troops in tactical skill and fighting spirit, Wavell decided to launch a program of jungle training, trying to teach his troops how to exploit the lack of visibility on the ground and from the air to their advantage, just like the Japanese had done before. Even while Slim's Burma Corps was retreating into India, Wavell was also being pressured to go on the offensive once the monsoon season ended steadily, with the objective of both restoring the Indian Army's shaken morale and prestige, and denying the Japanese the chance to launch an invasion of eastern India. Because of its short distance and theoretically adequate lines of communication from the front, the airfields in Akyab and northern Arakan were selected as the objectives for this first counterattack, with Wavell planning to launch an amphibious invasion of this area, supported by an overland diversion that intended to draw away its defenders. Yet, as the IJN fully controlled the Bay of Bengal, the amphibious 29th British Brigade was still fighting in Madagascar, and the necessary landing craft weren't available, Wavell had to change his original plans for Operation Cannibal in October. Instead of the planned amphibious invasion, the 14th Indian Division of Major General Wilfred Lewis Lloyd was to advance along the Arakan coast to Foul Point, where they would be reinforced by the 6th British Brigade to launch an assault on Akyab across the Mayu River. Lloyd was also ordered to capture Ranthadong village to prevent the Japanese from using this river. As the planning for the Arakan offensive advanced, Irwin promptly decided to redeploy Slim's 15th Corps at Renchi to raise fresh divisions and train these units in jungle combat, while Irwin himself assumed personal command of the 14th and 26th Indian Divisions for the coming offensive. This was such a clumsy and convoluted command arrangement that it can only be explained by Irwin's desire to keep Slim away from an important operational role. A compulsive micromanager, Irwin would thus personally deal at the same time with the domestic insurgencies in northern India, the administrative duties of his army from Calcutta to Fort Hertz, and the battalion-level control of the First Arakan Campaign. Truly a recipe for disaster. Meanwhile, General Iida's 15th Army was studying plans for an advance into India. but the necessary troops were not available, and overland communications did not seem able to support an offensive. Instead, Iida was ordered to stabilize the region and make it self-supporting, while at the same time maintaining pressure against the Chinese from Burma, French Indochina, and Thailand. It's important to note that the Chinese intervention in the invasion of Burma had effectively avoided an unmitigated catastrophe for the British. If the 100,000 soldiers of Stilwell's CEF hadn't appeared, it's likely that the Burma Corps would have been annihilated, and as a consequence, the Japanese could have penetrated India as far as Calcutta without facing any meaningful opposition. This, coupled with the civil insurrection that India was developing, could have brought a complete collapse to British rule in India. In any case, after the evacuation of Burma, the mere presence of the Chinese in Yunnan was enough to dissuade the Japanese from invading India, as their eastern flank would have been exposed. By the end of August, however, Iida was finally ordered to prepare to occupy northeast Assam and the Chittagong area, and to cut off the air supply line to China through the hump. In compliance, Iida developed a plan in September, which called for the 33rd and 55th Divisions to advance to the line of Silchar-Dimapur in Assam, while the 18th Division captured Goligat and advanced up the Hukuang Valley to occupy Ledo and Tinsukia, thus effectively destroying the airline to China. Yet Lieutenant General Motoguchi Renya of the 18th Division, along with General Sakurai of the 33rd, strongly complained about the geographic and logistical obstacles of the Chin Hills, eventually forcing Iida to drop his plan by December 23rd and to adopt a defensive stance in Burma. In the meantime, the Japanese would embark on the construction of a rail line connecting the Burmese and Thai rail systems, for which they would forcefully employ more than 60,000 Allied prisoners of war and 260,000 Burmese natives. Treating them with their usual ruthlessness, tens of thousands of victims would horrifyingly die while constructing this death railway. It is said that for every mile completed, 325 men died. Looking back at Arakan, the 33rd Division counted with around 3,000 men of the 213th Regiment in the area of North Arakan by September. Around that time, the 14th Indian Division was first ordered to move south of Chittagong to gain contact with the Japanese, sending forward the 47th Indian Brigade and leaving its 55th Indian Brigade to guard the Chittagong area. Its mission was for the brigades of the 14th Division to reach their designated jumping-off positions around Foul Point by December 1st. To scout the movements of Japanese troops in the area, the British employed the V-Force, a guerrilla stay-behind force that was formed to harass the Japanese lines of communication with ambushes and sabotage had they invaded India by late 1942. In October, as V-Force reported the area clear of Japanese presence, General Lloyd sent a small detachment into Mongdor, then sending some patrols into Buthadong by October 15th. This sparked a quick Japanese response, as the 2nd Battalion of the 213th Regiment was immediately sent to Buthadong, successfully landing on October 24th and forcing the British to retreat back to Cox's Bazar. Lloyd then used the month of November to bring forward the 123rd Indian Brigade so that he could attack the Mongdor-Buthadong line on December 2nd, where the 2nd Battalion had been digging strong defensive positions for the last 50 days. At the same time, the Allied air forces allocated a substantial amount of aircraft to support the Arakan offensive, while the small 2000th Flotilla was assigned to support the amphibious assault. In the end, however, the movement of the British troops would be slower than expected due to the difficult physical geography and the bad British logistics. During this time, Colonel Miyawaki Kosuke would order his 2nd Battalion to evacuate the Mongdor-Buthadong line to join the main body of the force near the tip of the Mayu Peninsula in a well-executed tactical withdrawal. On December 16th, Lloyd's forces finally started their attack, unopposedly reoccupying Mongdor and Buthadong one day later. From there, the 47th and 123rd Brigades would advance east of the Mayu River towards Rathadong and down the coast to Foul Point. At this point, as Miyawaki decided to send his 2nd Battalion to prepare defensive positions at Rathadong and his 1st Battalion to do the same at Donbaik, General Iida had ordered the 55th Division of Lieutenant General Koga Takeshi to reinforce the defense of Arakan. By December 28th, the 2nd Battalion successfully forestalled the 123rd Brigade and reoccupied Rathodong, while the 47th Brigade had advanced up to Indin. In the next couple of days, the British would unsuccessfully attempt to push back the defenders at Rathodong and Donbaik, suffering many casualties at the hands of the enemy's automatic fire and snipers, even despite the fact that they enjoyed increasing air support for the first time in the Burma campaign. On January 10, 1943, Generals Wavell and Irvin visited the front, where Lloyd asked them to give him some tanks of Slim's 50th Indian Tank Brigade to break through the Japanese bunkers. Trying to keep Slim as far away as possible from the campaign, Irwin only assigned 8 Valentine tanks to the Donbaik front, itself a natural anti-tank position due to it being situated alongside a Chong tidal creek. Lloyd would continue to throw all he had against the entrenched enemy throughout January, but each time the outcome was the same: a disappointing defeat and a humiliatingly massive amount of casualties. By the end of January, the 55th Brigade, reinforced with the 8 Valentine tanks, was sent to relieve the battered 47th Brigade as a result. On February 1st, it too would launch a frontal assault against Donbaik's Chong dugouts, yet some tanks would become stuck in ditches, while others would be knocked out by Japanese anti-tank guns and shellfire, with the brigade's attack subsequently faltering. 2 days later, the 123rd Brigade launched a renewed attack against Rathodong, and despite enjoying an initial success and capturing some outlying positions, the Indians would at last be defeated, suffering such heavy casualties that the brigade would be forced to withdraw back to Buthodong. Meanwhile, at the start of March, Miyawaki's 3rd Battalion was brought forward from the valley of the Caledon River, where it had defeated V-Force as the British guerrillas attempted to threaten the Japanese lines of communication. And Lloyd had deployed the 55th and 47th Brigades east of the Mayu River to continue putting pressure on Rathodong, as Irwin had sent the well-trained 6th British Brigade to take over the Donbaik front. In the first week of March, however, the 3rd Battalion of the 213th Regiment crossed the Mayu River and attacked the 155th Brigade, forcing the Indians to retreat and leaving the 47th Brigade isolated to the north of Rathodong. Looking at New Guinea, we can find many similarities between the Japanese defense of buna-gona and Arakan. Both the Australians and Americans were suffering enormous losses against the entrenched enemy, but they were now beginning to learn how to defeat them, and thus were dispelling the myth of Japanese superiority. The British, however, were again showing such an abysmal performance that it would only strengthen the myth, and had the consequence that the Indian troops believed that the Japanese soldiers were some sort of supermen. We will continue to cover the First Arakan Campaign and other developments in the CBI theatre in the future. But next week we'll return to the Buna area to cover the renewed Allied offensive against the tenacious Japanese defenders. So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.